crimson sun bled across Ghost Hollow's broken storefronts, as dust devils twisted through shattered windows like harbingers of judgment. Wind scoured the empty street, carrying the bitter taste of alkali, and the weight of dreams turned to ash. In the shadow of a half-collapsed cabin at the settlement's edge, Matilda Fisher pressed her palms into rough dough, her sleeves torn from the morning's desperate work of gathering mesquite beans, while dodging the patrols that had been hunting her for weeks. The dough fought her coarse flour mixed with precious water from her last canteen, stubborn as this land that seemed determined to break anyone foolish enough to call it home. Her hands, calloused from months of wandering between ghost towns and dried-up homesteads, worked the mass until it yielded like a prayer finally answered. The Dutch oven sat ready on the makeshift table, a plank stretched between two barrels, while beef bones simmered in her only pot. The smell of cooking filled the cramped space like hope made tangible. "I ain't pretty, sir," she whispered to the empty room, practicing words she'd spoken too many times before, to traders and travelers who needed sustenance more than beauty. "But I can cook." A shadow filled the doorway, blocking out the dying light like an omen. Matilda's hands stilled flour dusting her fingers, like snow in hell itself. The figure stood backlit against the crimson sky, tall and lean, with a bullet-grazed shoulder visible through his torn cotton shirt. A young Chiricahua Apache warrior, she realized, taking in the dark hair that hung past his shoulders and the old U.S. Scout's hat looped to his belt like a badge of shame he couldn't abandon. His left hand pressed against his wounded shoulder, fingers dark with dried blood that spoke of recent violence and narrow escapes from death itself. He breathed in deep, and she watched his chest expand as the smell of stew and rising bread reached him like salvation. For a heartbeat that felt like eternity, neither moved. Then his dark eyes found hers across the dim space, and she saw something there that made her breath catch in her throat, hunger that went deeper than an empty belly, exhaustion that spoke of too many hard miles and choices that carved scars on a man's soul. "Ma'am," he said, voice gravelly from thirst and the weight of unspoken words that might never find release. Outside, the rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, growing closer with each measured beat, like death's own drum, announcing the end of something precious. Multiple riders moving fast with the purposeful cadence of hunters who'd found fresh trail and smelled blood in the water. The warrior's head snapped toward the sound, every muscle in his body coiling like a spring under killing tension. Through the gaps in the cabin's warped boards, Matilda glimpsed the glint of steel and the blue of cavalry uniforms, the sight hitting her like ice water flooding her veins. The warrior stepped inside without invitation, moving with fluid silence born of walking between worlds and finding safety in neither. He gestured toward the fire with quick, economical movements, and then made a sharp cutting motion across his throat. "Kill the flames. Now." No discussion, no hesitation, just the absolute certainty of someone who understood that hesitation meant death. Matilda understood with crystalline clarity that comes only in moments when everything hangs by a thread. She grabbed sand from beside the hearth and smothered the coals, plunging them into shadow, just as voices carried on the wind like whispers from the grave itself. "Spread out. Check every building, every hidey hole, every place a rat might squeeze into. The cook's here somewhere, and that renegade scout ain't far behind her trail." Captain Silas Vance's voice cut through the evening air like a blade drawn across bone, sharp with authority and cold as mountain ice. Matilda had heard that voice before in nightmares that woke her screaming, and in stories whispered around emigrant campfires when the night grew too dark and hope too distant. Stories of water rights stolen of families, driven from springs that had sustained travelers for generations, of a man who sold survival to the highest bidder and buried anyone who questioned the price. The warrior positioned himself between her and the doorway, without being asked, his wounded shoulder forgotten in the face of immediate peril. His hands moved to check the rifle propped against the wall. A Winchester Model 1873 lever-action rifle. 15 rounds that gleamed with the oil and care of a man who knew his life depended on his weapon's reliability. 15 shots if the magazine was full. And in this situation, every bullet would have to count like gospel truth. How many? She whispered, her voice barely more than expelled breath. He held up both hands twice, then added 3 fingers with the precision of someone who'd learned to count enemies by necessity and survival. 23 men, maybe more. Too many for one rifle, and whatever weapons she might have hidden, too many for anything but prayer, and the kind of desperate cunning that separated the living from the dead in this unforgiving country. Boot steps crunched on gravel outside, deliberate and searching each footfall, bringing death closer to their hiding place like seconds ticking toward midnight. The warrior's eyes met hers, and in that moment of connection, she saw past the blood and trail-worn clothes to something that made her chest tighten with recognition. This was a man carrying weights that had nothing to do with his pack guilt that gnawed at you in the quiet hours, choices that left scars deeper than any bullet could carve. He jerked his chin toward the back of the cabin with urgent economy. There was a door there, hanging crooked on leather hinges, that had seen better decades. Beyond it lay the dry creek bed, and whatever chance they might have of living to see another sunrise in this merciless territory. Matilda grabbed her canvas sack, her movements sharp with desperation, as she swept her precious jar of sourdough starter into it, along with what flour remained, and her one good knife. The stew would have to stay, though abandoning it tore at her like leaving behind pieces of her soul. The bread, too, its crust just beginning to form that perfect golden brown that spoke of warmth and home, and everything this harsh country seemed determined to strip away. Food was life out here, and she'd been trading that life one meal at a time for months. Ever since the trail had taken everything else from her, and left her with nothing but recipes and the memory of her brother's laugh. They slipped out the back as boots thundered across the plank floor behind them, the sound of systematic destruction following in their wake like the echo of broken promises and shattered dreams. In the dry creek bed, they moved like ghosts through sand and scattered stones, the warrior favoring his wounded shoulder, but never slowing, never complaining, his breathing controlled, despite pain that must have been coursing through him like liquid fire. "Name's Kitchy," he said, as they reached a cluster of boulders that had tumbled from canyon walls in some ancient catastrophe. Means brave in my grandmother's tongue, though she might argue the point after some of the choices I've made. Matilda Fisher. From Bavaria originally, though, that feels like another lifetime now. She brushed dust from her skirts, then looked up at him, seeing him clearly for the first time in decent light. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 25, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor living and choices that aged a man beyond his years. "You were scouting for Vance." Kitchy's jaw tightened like a trap snapping shut, and his hand moved unconsciously to his wounded shoulder. Was. Not anymore. Haven't been since Devil's Wash, and I pray to every spirit my grandmother taught me that I never will be again. "They'll track us come morning," she said, stating what they both knew, because sometimes truth needed to be acknowledged before it could be faced. Probably before dawn if this wind dies down. Vance doesn't give up easy, I know that better than most, and he's got the Mercer brothers riding with him now. They can track a whisper across stone if the price is right. Behind them, shouts echoed through the brown dust storm that had risen to cover their escape. They rode Kitchy's paint horse through the night, fleeing deeper into the canyon country, until exhaustion and the need for shelter forced them to seek refuge in a stand of cottonwoods beside a seasonal stream. As they sat by a carefully shielded fire, sharing jerked meat and water, that tasted like hope itself, Kitchi told her about her brother Klaus. "I was there when he died." He said the simple statement hanging between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. The familiar ache bloomed in Matilda's chest, grief that never quite lifted no matter how many miles she put behind her or how many meals she cooked for strangers. "Tell me," she said, and it was both plea and demand. Vance hired him to guide a water convoy through Devil's Wash. Said it was routine supply run for railroad camps, just moving barrels from one depot to another. But Klaus started asking questions when he saw how much water they were hauling, more than any supply run needed. Kitchi's voice was carefully neutral, the tone of a man who'd learned to deliver bad news without letting it destroy him. He was always too curious for his own good. Curious got him killed, but it also got him the truth. When the convoy hit the wash, Klaus figured out what was really happening. Vance was stealing water contracted for the San Carlos Reservation, selling it to railroad camps instead. Every barrel that didn't reach the reservation meant families going thirsty, children getting sick, elders dying before their time. Matilda closed her eyes, seeing Klaus's face as clearly as if he stood before her stubborn, idealistic Klaus, with his unwavering sense of justice and belief that right was right, regardless of cost. "They left him in the wash?" Kitchi continued. "Told everyone it was an accident, convoy got bogged down, he tried to free wagons and got crushed when one shifted. But I saw the bullet hole in the back of his head, saw how his hands were tied with rope that wasn't part of any convoy equipment." "You were there. Why didn't you stop it?" The question hung between them like an accusation, though she hadn't meant it that way. She could see the pain it caused him, the way his shoulders tensed, as if absorbing a blow. "I tried. Vance had me and my scout unit positioned on the rim, said we were providing security while his men handled civilian contractors. When Klaus started making noise about reporting the theft, Vance ordered us to keep the ridge clear while he handled the situation personally. I heard the shot and tried to get down there, but Vance's men opened fire on us. Said later we'd been attacked by raiders. That's where you got hurt. Among other places." He rolled his shoulder carefully. "That was the night I stopped being a scout for the U.S. Army. Took me this long to work up courage to do something about it. Those symbols in your recipe book," Kitchi said finally. "Klaus taught them to you." Matilda nodded, throat too tight for words at first. "Said they were important, more important than anything else he'd ever shown me. Made me copy them over and over until I could draw them in my sleep. They are water rights surveys from when this territory was first mapped for settlement. Klaus found the original documents in Vance's files, proof that most springs between here and Colorado were designated for prior appropriation rights. Travelers and tribes, both protected by territorial statute, recorded with the Surveyor General's office." Understanding crashed over her like cold water. She'd been carrying evidence of Vance's crimes, without knowing it, transcribing her brother's final act of defiance into her collection of bread recipes and herb lore. "That's why he's hunting me. That's why we're both dead if he catches us." They were found by Ruth Turner the next morning, a 12-year-old girl with stringy brown hair and a rifle she held with practiced confidence. Her father, Eli Turner, had been burned out by Vance's men, along with 2 other homesteading families, who'd refused to abandon claims to land that included natural springs. Turner's safe place turned out to be an abandoned mine shaft carved into red sandstone cliffs above Devil's Wash, its entrance hidden behind juniper and sage. Inside the shaft opened into a natural cave system, where Turner waited with Bill Henderson and Tom Dawson homesteaders, whose families had been driven from their land by Vance's systematic intimidation. "Miss Fisher," Turner said, rising from where he'd been sitting on a crate of supplies. "Glad to see you made it this far with all your parts still attached." Turner explained their situation with military precision. Judge Wilkes, the circuit judge, was due in Cedar Ford for the monthly court session. If they could get Matilda's evidence to him along with testimony about Vance's crimes, he might issue federal warrants that even corrupt military officials couldn't ignore. Problem is, Vance knows about it too, Turner continued. He's been moving his men into position all week, making sure nobody gets a chance to talk to the judge about uncomfortable subjects. They spent hours planning, mapping out Cedar Ford's layout and Vance's likely defensive positions. It would require splitting their forces. Turner and his men would create a distraction at the mill, while Kitchie and Matilda slipped into town to reach Judge Wilkes. There's one more thing, Turner said as they prepared to leave. Dr. Reeve sent word. He's been working with us, feeding Vance false information to get him out of position. The doctor's got his own reasons for wanting to see justice done. That evening, as they prepared for what might be their final mission, Matilda and Kitchie found themselves alone beside the dying fire in the cave's main chamber. The others had settled in for the night, but both were too keyed up by the proximity of tomorrow's confrontation to find rest. "You don't have to do this," Kitchie said quietly. "You could slip away tonight, head for California or Oregon. Start over somewhere safe." "I could," Matilda agreed, staring into the glowing coals. "But I won't." "Why not?" She looked at him, then seeing his face in the firelight. "Because Klaus died believing that doing the right thing mattered more than staying safe. Because those children in Cedar Ford need medicine, and Dr. Reeve needs help providing it. Because Ruth Turner deserves to grow up in a world where bullies don't always win." She paused, studying his weathered features and the way the firelight played across the scars that marked his chest and arms, evidence of battles fought and survived, choices made when courage mattered more than safety. "Tell me about your unit," she said softly. "The other scouts who were with you that night." Kitchie was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with memories that clearly brought pain. "There were 5 of us originally. Young men, mostly Chiricahua, Apache, and Crow, who'd signed up thinking we could serve both our people and the government. Maybe find some middle ground between two worlds that seemed determined to tear each other apart." He picked up a stick and stirred the coals, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. Tommy Crow Feather was the youngest, barely 18, full of ideas about honor and duty, and serving the greater good. He believed every word the officers told us about protecting settlers and keeping the peace, even when the orders started getting questionable. What happened to him? Devil's wash. When Vance ordered us to hold the ridge while he dealt with your brother, Tommy questioned the orders. Said it didn't feel right leaving civilians unprotected while we sat on a hill watching. Vance told him to follow orders or face court-martial for insubordination. Kitchie's voice grew thick with emotion he'd been carrying for months. Tommy tried to reach Klaus anyway. Figured he could get down there, help with whatever was happening, and get back before anyone noticed. But Vance had positioned sharpshooters in case any of us got ideas about disobeying orders. The implications hit Matilda like a physical blow. They shot him. Made it look like he'd been killed by the same raiders who supposedly attacked the convoy. Tommy died trying to do what was right, and I was too much of a coward to back him up when it mattered. The words came out raw with self-recrimination that had been eating at him ever since that night. Matilda reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of a hard life lived on the edge of violence. "You're not a coward. You're here now risking everything to make up for what happened. That takes more courage than anything Tommy asked of you that night. Sometimes I wonder if Klaus and Tommy are watching from wherever the dead go, thinking I should have done more, should have acted sooner. I think," Matilda said carefully, They're proud that you finally found the strength to stand up for what they died believing in. Klaus always said that redemption wasn't about being perfect. It was about learning from your mistakes and doing better when the next test came. She told him about the last time she'd seen her brother alive, a memory she'd kept locked away because it hurt too much to examine in the harsh light of loss. It was Christmas morning, 1878. We were camped outside Prescott, planning to spend the winter there before heading to California in the spring. Klaus had found work with a surveying crew, good steady pay that would set us up with enough money to buy proper equipment and maybe even a small piece of land. The memory was so vivid. She could smell the pine smoke from their campfire, could hear the sound of other emigrant families preparing their own holiday meals in the cold morning air. I was making strudel, or trying to anyway. The dough wasn't cooperating, and I was getting frustrated because I wanted everything to be perfect. Klaus came over and started helping, even though he couldn't bake to save his life. He kept making jokes about how the dough looked like it was fighting back, kept making me laugh until I forgot to be angry about things not going according to plan. Her voice grew soft with the kind of tenderness that survives even the deepest grief. When we finally got the strudel into the Dutch oven, he looked at me and said, "Tilly, you know what I like best about cooking with you?" I asked him what, and he said, "It reminds me that even when everything seems impossible, if you keep working at it with someone you love, you can still make something beautiful." Tears she thought she'd finished shedding began to flow again. But they felt different now. Less like raw grief and more like the kind of cleansing sorrow that makes room for new growth. 3 weeks later, he took that job with Vance's convoy. Said it was just one more score enough money to buy us a real oven, and maybe even hire help for the bakery we were planning to open in Sacramento. He was so excited about the future, so sure that everything was going to work out perfectly. Kitchi squeezed her hand, understanding the weight of guilt that came from being the one who survived when someone you loved had died, pursuing dreams you'd shared. "He was right about one thing," he said quietly. "You did make something beautiful. Maybe not the bakery you planned, but something just as important. Every person you fed these past months, every family you've helped, that's Klaus's legacy living on through you." "And what about Tommy's legacy?" she asked. "Maybe it's this. Maybe it's finally having the courage to stand up to the people who killed him, to make sure his death meant something more than just another casualty in someone else's war for profit." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands joined in the darkness, drawing strength from each other for whatever morning might bring. Around them, the cave held the quiet sounds of people sleeping, fitfully preparing in their dreams for battles they might not survive. "There's something else I need to tell you," Matilda said eventually, her voice barely above a whisper. "About why I really can't run away. Why I have to see this through regardless of what it costs." She told him about the families she'd encountered during her months of wandering the Hendersons, whose children had nearly died of fever until her broth and bread gave them strength to fight off the sickness. The widow Martinez, struggling to keep her homestead running after her husband died, who traded work for meals that kept her and her 4 children alive through a harsh winter. The young couple from Tennessee, lost and desperate on the trail, who'd found hope again in the simple act of sharing supper with someone who cared whether they lived or died. Every person I've fed everyone who's made it through another day, because I knew how to turn flour and water into something nourishing. They're all connected now. They're part of something bigger than just my personal grief over losing Klaus. If I run away, if I abandon the fight now, then all of that connection means nothing. She looked at him with eyes that held the accumulated weight of every life she'd touched, every small act of kindness that had grown into something approaching a calling. "I think I'm falling in love with a stubborn Chiricahua Apache warrior who refuses to run away from fights he can't win," she said, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from finally understanding her own heart. "But more than that, I'm falling in love with the man who showed me that some battles are worth fighting even when you can't be sure you'll win them. Kitschy's expression didn't change immediately, but she saw something shift in his eyes, surprise giving way to recognition of a truth he'd been trying to ignore. That warrior's got excellent taste in cooks. He said finally, his voice carrying warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Even if he's probably too stupid and beat up to deserve her attention. From across the cave, Ruth Turner's young voice cut through their moment of connection with the practical urgency that seemed to be her specialty. "Miss Fisher." Ruth had stirred from her bedroll and was looking at them with the kind of serious attention that made her seem older than her 12 years. "Can I ask you something about that book you carry?" Matilda nodded, gesturing for the girl to join them by the fire. Ruth moved with quiet care so as not to wake the men settling cross-legged on the packed earth with her blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a shawl. "Pa says it's got something in it that can prove Captain Vance is stealing water from folks who need it. But I don't understand how marks on paper can be more powerful than rifles and hired killers." Matilda opened her canvas sack and withdrew the leather-bound recipe book, its worn cover bearing the stains and scratches of months of hard travel. To anyone else, it would look like nothing more than a frontier woman's collection of practical knowledge, recipes, remedies, and household wisdom accumulated over years of making do with whatever was available. "You see these symbols here?" Matilda pointed to markings scattered throughout the pages, carefully drawn between instructions for sourdough maintenance and notes about wild herb identification. "My brother Klaus copied these from official government documents. They show who has the legal right to use water from springs and streams throughout this territory." Ruth studied the symbols with the focused attention of someone who'd learned to read by necessity rather than leisure. They look like the marks surveyors make when they're measuring land. That's exactly what they are. When this territory was first mapped for settlement, the government set aside most of the natural water sources for prior appropriation rights. That means they belong to everyone, travelers, settlers, tribal nations, not to whoever can pay the most money to corrupt officials. But Captain Vance has been selling those water rights like they belong to him. Exactly. And when people like your father refuse to pay his prices, he uses violence and intimidation to drive them away from land and they have every legal right to occupy. Ruth was quiet for a moment, processing the implications with the kind of mature understanding that came from growing up in circumstances where adult concerns became childhood realities far too early. So, if Judge Wilkes sees these symbols and understands what they mean, he can issue federal warrants that will stop Vance permanently. Not just arrest him, but restore the water rights to their proper legal status and protect families like yours from future interference. And that's worth dying for. The question hung in the air between them, simple and direct, in the way that only children could manage when asking about the fundamental choices that defined adult lives. Matilda looked at Ruth's young face in the firelight, seeing intelligence and courage that reminded her of herself at that age, before the world had taught her that safety was often purchased at the cost of principle. "I hope we don't have to die for it," she said honestly. "But yes, it's worth that risk. Because if we don't stand up to people like Vance, if we let them win through fear and violence, then what kind of world are we leaving for you and children like you?" Ruth nodded solemnly, accepting the answer with the gravity of someone who understood that tomorrow might bring consequences that would shape the rest of her life. "Will you teach me how to read the symbols?" she asked. "So that if something happens to you, if the book gets lost or damaged, someone else will know what they mean." The request hit Matilda with unexpected force. The realization that this young girl was thinking beyond immediate survival to the continuity of knowledge and justice that would outlast any individual battle. "Of course," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But we'll start with the basics. The most important thing to remember is that these markings represent something that belongs to all of us. They're not just lines on paper, they're the difference between freedom and oppression, between communities that thrive and communities that get crushed by people who think power gives them the right to take whatever they want. They spent the next hour in quiet instruction, Matilda explaining the meaning of each symbol, while Ruth practiced copying them on scraps of paper with careful attention to detail. It was a small act of defiance against the uncertainty of what morning might bring, passing knowledge to the next generation, ensuring that even if the worst happened, the truth would survive to fight another day. When Ruth finally returned to her bedroll, leaving Matilda and Kitchi alone beside the dying fire, they sat in comfortable silence that spoke of understanding deeper than words. "You're going to make it through this," Kitchi said quietly. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you're going to survive and keep fighting for what's right. I can see it in you, the same strength that kept you alive all these months when everything seemed hopeless." "We're going to make it through this," Matilda corrected firmly. "Both of us. Together. Because I refuse to fall in love with someone just in time to lose him to a fight we should have been smart enough to avoid." Is that what we're doing? Falling in love? I think we fell in love the moment you stepped into that cabin and decided to help a stranger instead of protecting yourself. Everything since then has just been us figuring out what that means. They leaned against each other in the firelight, two people who'd found something worth protecting in each other and in the community they'd helped to create through shared danger and mutual trust. Outside the cave, the desert wind carried the scent of storm clouds gathering on the horizon, promising change whether they were ready for it or not. But for now, they had each other, and they had a plan that might actually work, and they had the kind of desperate hope that sustained people through the worst of times and occasionally delivered them to something better. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation with Captain Silas Vance, and with it the chance to either redeem Klaus's sacrifice or see it rendered meaningless by their own failure. But tonight they were alive, they were together, and they were surrounded by people who shared their commitment to justice over safety. In this harsh country that was more than many people could hope for, and far more than either of them had dared to expect when this desperate flight began. The trap dawn came gray and cold to Cedar Ford, with storm clouds gathering on the western horizon, like an army preparing for battle. The town drowsed under the overcast sky, its handful of buildings clustered around the main street, looking deceptively peaceful in the pale light. But Kitchi's trained eye picked out the wrongness immediately as they approached from the eastern ridge. Too many horses tied behind buildings that should have been empty. Too many men in positions that offered good fields of fire down the main street. Vance had turned the entire town into a carefully prepared killing ground. "It's a trap," he murmured to Matilda as they crouched behind a boulder outcropping that overlooked the settlement. "The whole thing." Turner was right about one thing Vance knows about Judge Wilkes coming to town. But he's not just trying to prevent testimony. He's using the judge as bait to draw us out into the open, where he can finish this permanently. Through his field glasses, Kitchi could see the courthouse at the center of town, a modest wooden building with a bell tower that would serve as an excellent sniper's nest. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting someone was inside preparing for the day's session. But the building was surrounded by positions that could pour deadly crossfire into anyone approaching from any direction. The approach to Cedar Ford required crossing 200 yards of open ground that offered minimal cover, a few scattered boulders, a dry creek bed that was barely 3 feet deep, and the burned remains of a homestead that provided concealment, but no real protection from rifle fire. Kitchi studied the terrain with professional assessment, noting sight lines and calculating the time it would take to move from one position to another under hostile fire. Matilda pointed to a figure moving near the schoolhouse at the town's edge. Even at this distance, the man's bearing was unmistakable. Dr. Owen Reeve making his morning rounds with his medical bag and his mule Molly. If Dr. Reeve is still free to move around, maybe the trap isn't completely closed yet. Kitschy studied the doctor's movements, noting how he seemed to be following a specific pattern, visiting certain buildings in a deliberate sequence. He's signaling. See how he's positioning himself. That's not random. He's trying to tell us something. As they watched, Dr. Reeve moved to the water trough in front of the general store and began washing his hands with elaborate care, his movements visible from their vantage point on the ridge. He repeated the motion 3 times, then moved to tend his mule with equally exaggerated attention, pointing toward specific buildings as if explaining something to the animal. 3, Matilda said. He's telling us there are 3 of something, and those buildings he's pointing to. Positions he's identified as threats, Kitschy finished. Or maybe safe approaches. Either way, he's trying to help us. They worked their way down from the ridge, using every scrap of cover the broken terrain provided. Kitschy moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years learning to be invisible when necessary, while Matilda followed with careful attention to every instruction he gave her: when to move, when to freeze, how to distribute her weight, to avoid dislodging loose stones that might betray their position. The first real test came when they had to cross the open creek bed that ran along the town's eastern edge. It was only 30 yards of exposure, but 30 yards where a vigilant sentry could spot them and raise an alarm that would bring every gun in town to bear on their position. Kitschy went first, timing his movement to coincide with a cloud passing over the sun, using the momentary change in light and shadow to mask his crossing. He made it look effortless, flowing from boulder to boulder like water finding its natural course. But Matilda could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his wounded side restricted his movement, despite his efforts to hide the limitation. When her turn came, she found her heart hammering so hard against her ribs that she was certain it must be audible to anyone within 50 yards. The creek bed seemed to stretch into infinity, each step taking forever, while her mind conjured images of rifle sights tracking her movement, fingers tightening on triggers, the devastating impact of bullets finding their mark. But she made it across, without incident, reaching the shelter of a ruined wagon, where Kitschy waited with his rifle ready and his eyes constantly scanning for threats. Good. He whispered, his voice barely audible, even at close range. Now comes the hard part. The first building they reached was the old blacksmith shop at the town's eastern edge, abandoned since the smith had died of fever the previous winter. Through gaps in the weathered boards, they could see clear lines of sight to the courthouse and most of the main street. It would have been perfect for their purposes, except for the fresh hoof prints in the dirt outside and the faint smell of tobacco smoke that suggested recent occupation. Kitschy held up his hand, stopping their approach while he studied the building with intense focus. Something wasn't right, and the door hung slightly ajar in a way that looked natural, but probably wasn't, and there was a quality to the silence from inside that spoke of held breath and deliberate stillness rather than genuine emptiness. Someone's been using this place. He whispered, his hand moving instinctively to his rifle. Question is whether they're still here. They were moving to circle around the building when the sound of a boot shifting on wooden planks inside answered the question for them. Someone was definitely there, and they were trying to stay quiet in a way that suggested hostile intent. Kitschy caught Matilda's eye and gestured toward a position behind a pile of scrap iron that would give them cover, while allowing them to watch both the front and back of the blacksmith shop. They were just settling into the new position when a voice called out from inside the building, casual and confident, with the particular satisfaction of a hunter who'd successfully cornered his prey. No point hiding out there. We know you're here, and we've got all the time in the world to wait you out. The answer came in the form of a metallic click that every frontier dweller recognized instantly, the sound of a rifle hammer being drawn back to full cock. They froze, knowing that any sudden movement would likely be their last. "Well, well," the familiar voice drawled from the shadows inside the building. "Look what the cat dragged in. Jake Mercer said you two were slipperier than greased snakes, but here you are walking right into our parlor like invited guests." Samuel Mercer stepped into view through the blacksmith shop's doorway, his rifle aimed with casual precision at Kitchy's chest. The younger of the two notorious brothers looked exactly like what he was, a professional killer who took pride in his work and had never learned to question the morality of his contracts. "Where's your brother?" Kitchy asked, his voice steady despite the proximity of violent death. "Jake's positioned where he needs to be," Samuel replied with the confidence of someone who held all the good cards. "We figured you'd try to come in from this direction. It's what any sensible person would do. Captain Vance pays us to think ahead, and thinking ahead pays well in our line of work." "What does Vance want?" Matilda asked, stepping slightly forward despite Kitchy's warning gesture. Samuel's eyes flicked to her with interest that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with the bounty on her head. "Wants that recipe book you've been carrying around like it was the Holy Bible. Wants to have a conversation with you about some symbols your late brother copied before he had his unfortunate accident. Wants to make sure this whole unpleasant business gets settled permanently. And if I refuse, then you die here, and Jake and I collect the bounty Vance posted for your bodies instead of the bonus he's offering for bringing you and breathing. Either way works fine for us, though the captain seemed to think you might be more cooperative if you had proper motivation." Samuel gestured with his rifle toward the courthouse, where a new figure had appeared on the front steps. Even at this distance, Judge Wilkes was recognizable, a tall, dignified man in his 60s, with white hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades dispensing justice on the frontier. But there was something wrong with the scene. The judge's movement seemed stiff, unnatural, as if he were being directed by someone out of sight. And there, barely visible in the courthouse doorway, was the unmistakable outline of another armed man. "That's right," Samuel said, reading their expressions. "His Honor is currently enjoying Captain Vance's hospitality while we wait for you to make your choice. Cooperate, and maybe the good judge lives to see another circuit. Keep being difficult, and we start sending pieces of him back to the territorial capital until they appoint someone more reasonable." The situation had deteriorated beyond anything they'd planned for. Not only were they walking into a carefully prepared trap, but innocent lives were now at stake in ways that made simple escape impossible. Kitchy caught Matilda's eye and made a subtle gesture toward his wounded shoulder, then toward the rifle propped against the blacksmith's forge. She understood immediately he was going to create a distraction by feigning weakness, giving her a chance to reach the weapon. It was desperate, probably suicidal, but better than standing there waiting for Samuel to decide. Their conversation had run its course. But before either could act on the desperate plan, a new voice cut through the morning air with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Samuel Mercer, you're under arrest for conspiracy kidnapping and accessory to murder." Dr. Reeves stepped around the corner of the blacksmith shop, but he wasn't alone. Judge Wilkes walked beside him, very much alive and free, along with 3 men Matilda didn't recognize, all wearing the silver stars of federal marshals and carrying rifles with the confidence of people who knew how to use them. Samuel's rifle swung toward this new threat, but he was already too late. The trap he'd thought he was springing had become a trap that closed around him instead. "Drop your weapon." Judge Wilkes commanded, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority backed by armed force. "You're surrounded, outnumbered, and under federal warrant. Surrender now, and you'll live to stand trial." For a moment, Samuel Mercer weighed his options with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through years of violent work. His eyes moved from the marshals to Kitchy and Matilda, to the positions where he knew other members of Vance's force were waiting. But even professional killers occasionally found themselves in situations where survival required swallowing pride and accepting defeat. His rifle clattered to the ground, and he raised his hands with the bitter expression of someone who'd been outsmarted by opponents he'd underestimated. "Well played, Doc," he said to Dr. Reeve. "Didn't think you had it in you to run a game this complex?" "I had excellent help," Dr. Reeve replied dryly. "And unlike some people, I occasionally remember that there are things more important than money." One of the federal marshals moved to secure Samuel's weapons, while another took position to cover the courthouse, where the sound of shouting suggested that Jake Mercer and the rest of Vance's men were discovering that their carefully laid plans had gone badly awry. "How?" Matilda asked, still struggling to process the reversal of fortune that had just saved their lives. Judge Wilkes allowed himself a slight smile, the expression of someone who'd been playing a longer game than anyone had realized. "Dr. Reeves sent word to me weeks ago about suspicious activity in this territory. I've been investigating complaints about water rights violations throughout this region. But I needed solid evidence before I could justify federal intervention." "The judge arrived early," Dr. Reeve explained. "Came in yesterday evening with these marshals, but we kept his presence secret while we set up our own trap. Vance has been so focused on catching you two that he never considered the possibility that we might be hunting him. But even as the immediate threat was neutralized, the sound of gunfire erupted from the direction of the courthouse. Jake Mercer and the rest of Vance's men weren't going to surrender as easily as Samuel had, and the final confrontation was just beginning. Through the courthouse windows, they could see muzzle flashes and the movement of armed figures taking defensive positions. Captain Vance's voice boomed across the main street, magnified by the building's acoustics and carrying the ring of authority that had cowed lesser men for years. "Federal Marshals, I am Captain Silas Vance, operating under legitimate military authority in this territory. Any interference with my operations constitutes obstruction of justice and will be met with appropriate force." "He's bluffing," Judge Wilkes said grimly. "I've already verified that he has no current military standing. He was cashiered from the Army 6 months ago for misappropriation of supplies and conduct unbecoming an officer." "Then why haven't his men abandoned him?" Kitchie asked. "Because he's been paying them well enough that they don't care about the legalities. And because Jake Mercer has a reputation to maintain, he's never left a job unfinished, and he's not about to start now." The courthouse had become a fortress in the few minutes since Samuel Mercer's capture. Jake Mercer and 4 of Vance's gunmen had barricaded themselves inside with enough ammunition to hold off a small army, while Captain Vance himself had taken a position in the bell tower that commanded the entire main street. From their new position behind the general store, Kitchie studied the tactical situation with professional assessment. The courthouse was built of solid timber with narrow windows that provided excellent defensive positions while limiting the attacker's ability to return effective fire. Worse, the building's elevation gave Vance a commanding view of every approach route. "They've got us pinned down pretty thoroughly," he told Judge Wilkes, who had proven to be far more capable in a crisis than his dignified appearance suggested. "Any direct assault is going to cost lives we can't afford to lose." "What do you recommend?" the judge asked, checking the loads in a rifle that looked well-maintained despite his apparent scholarly nature. "Patience. Let them make the first move and react accordingly. They're trapped in there just as much as we're trapped out here, and time favors whoever has better supplies and more reinforcements coming." But Captain Silas Vance had no intention of waiting for a siege to develop. His voice boomed across the main street, amplified by the courthouse's acoustics and carrying the ring of authority that had cowed lesser men for years. "Dr. Reeve, I know you can hear me. Send out the fisherwoman and that renegade scout, and we can end this without any more bloodshed. You've got 10 minutes to consider the wisdom of cooperation before I start demonstrating what happens to communities that harbor fugitives." To emphasize his point, a rifle shot cracked from the bell tower, shattering the front window of the general store, and sending glass fragments raining onto the wooden sidewalk like crystal tears. The shot had been deliberately placed to avoid casualties, while making a point about Vance's tactical advantages, but its psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Through the buildings behind them, they could hear the sounds of townspeople barricading doors and shuttering windows, families huddling together in their homes while violence played out in their streets. "He's not bluffing," Dr. Reeves said grimly. "Vance has burned out homesteads for less provocation than this. If we don't end this quickly, he'll start targeting innocent townspeople to force our hand." From her position behind the water trough, Matilda could see faces at windows, frightened children peering through gaps in curtains, women clutching babies while their husbands reached for whatever weapons they had available. These people hadn't chosen to be part of this conflict, but Vance's presence had made them involuntary participants in a war between justice and corruption. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders again, heavier than ever. Every minute this standoff continued was another minute of terror for innocent families who deserved to live their lives without fear of violence erupting in their streets. "I'm going out there," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to choke her words. "Like hell you are," Kitchie replied immediately. "That's exactly what he wants, to get you in the open, where his rifle can reach you. And then, what we hide behind this building while he burns down the town around us. While innocent people die, because I'm too afraid to face the consequences of what my brother died trying to protect." Judge Wilkes studied her with the careful attention he usually reserved for weighing evidence in complex legal cases. "What did you have in mind, Miss Fisher?" Matilda reached into her canvas sack and withdrew the leather-bound recipe book that had been her constant companion through months of flight and fear. The volume looked innocuous enough, just a collection of cooking notes and household remedies that any frontier woman might carry. But hidden among the bread recipes and herb lore were the symbols Klaus had copied from Vance's files, the evidence that could hang a man or set him free depending on who controlled its interpretation. "Vance wants this book," she said, holding it up so the others could see. "Specifically, he wants to destroy it before anyone official can examine the water rights surveys my brother copied into it. But what if we give him exactly what he wants in a way that serves our purposes instead of his?" "I'm listening," Judge Wilkes said. "Dr. Reeve told me that you've been investigating complaints about water rights violations throughout this territory. You've been looking for solid evidence that would justify federal intervention, but most of the original documents have been destroyed or hidden by the people who profit from keeping them secret." "That's correct. The territorial government has been less than cooperative in providing access to survey records and land grants." Matilda opened the recipe book to a page that looked like nothing more than notations about sourdough maintenance and bread baking temperatures. But interspersed among the legitimate cooking notes were careful drawings that matched the symbols Klaus had seen in Vance's office survey markers and water rights designations that proved most of the springs in this territory had been set aside for prior appropriation rights rather than private exploitation. "My brother didn't just copy these symbols randomly," she explained. "He was trained as a surveyor before he took up guiding work. He knew what they meant, and he knew how to document them in a way that would hold up in federal court if anyone ever had the chance to examine them properly." Judge Wilkes studied the page with growing excitement, his legal mind immediately grasping the implications. "This is exactly what I've been looking for. With these survey notations and your testimony about how they were obtained, I can issue warrants that will bring federal marshals down on every corrupt official between here and Denver. But first, we have to survive long enough to make that happen. Kitschy pointed out with characteristic pragmatism. Which brings me to the second part of my plan. Matilda continued. Vance wants this book and he's willing to expose himself to get it. What if we give him the opportunity to take it from me personally, but on our terms, instead of his? She outlined her idea quickly, knowing the time was running short and Vance's patience was likely exhausted. It was audacious, risky, and dependent on timing that would have to be perfect to work. But it was also the kind of unexpected gambit that might succeed precisely because it was so bold. The plan required Vance to abandon his defensive position in the bell tower and come down to street level, where the federal marshals could bring their superior numbers to bear. But it also required Matilda to expose herself to potentially lethal danger, using herself as bait to draw him into the open. That's either brilliant or suicidal, Dr. Reeves said when she finished. Probably both, Matilda agreed. But it's better than sitting here waiting for him to start shooting innocent people. Judge Wilkes was quiet for a long moment, weighing legal precedent against frontier necessity with the kind of careful consideration that had made him respected throughout the territory. Finally, he nodded with the grave dignity of someone rendering judgment in a capital case. I'll allow it, he said formally. But I want it on record that this action is being taken under emergency circumstances with full federal authority to pursue justice by whatever means necessary. Kitschy looked like he wanted to argue further, but something in Matilda's expression must have convinced him that her mind was made up. Instead, he checked his rifle once more and positioned himself for the role she'd assigned him in the desperate gamble they were about to attempt. If this goes wrong, he began, then we'll deal with the consequences together. Matilda interrupted. Same as we've been doing since the day we met. But first, she had to make one more preparation. Taking the recipe book, she carefully tore out several pages that contained the most crucial survey symbols, folding them small and tucking them inside her boot, where they would be hidden, even if Vance managed to capture the book itself. The original evidence would survive, even if everything else went wrong. Insurance, she explained to Judge Wilkes, who nodded approvingly at her foresight. The final confrontation. She stepped out from behind the general store and into the main street, holding the recipe book, high enough for Vance to see it clearly from his position in the bell tower. Her heart hammered against her ribs, like a caged bird, but her voice was steady when she called out her challenge. No, Captain Vance, I have what you want. Let's finish this face-to-face like civilized people. The street fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through the buildings and the distant rumble of thunder from the approaching storm. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, nothing moved. Then Vance's voice echoed from the courthouse with the satisfaction of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. Miss Fisher, how good of you to see reason walk to the center of the street and place the book on the ground, then step back 10 paces, and we can conclude our business. No. Woo, Matilda shouted back, her voice carrying clearly across the distance that separated them. You want this book. You come down here and take it from me personally. I'm tired of running from a coward who hides behind hired killers and sends other men to do his dirty work. The insult hit its mark. Even at this distance, she could see Vance stiffen in the bell tower, his military pride warring with tactical common sense. For a man who'd built his reputation on command presence and personal authority, being called a coward in front of his subordinates was intolerable. You're in no position to make demands, Miss Fisher. Aren't I? Matilda opened the recipe book and tore out a page, holding it high before letting the wind carry it away, like a leaf in an autumn storm. Every page I destroy is evidence that dies with it. How many pages do you think this book contains, Captain? How many can you afford to lose before your crimes become impossible to cover up? She tore out another page, then another, each one fluttering away on the desert wind like pieces of her brother's legacy scattered to the four directions. But these were pages she'd selected carefully legitimate recipes and household notes that contained no evidence theatrical props in her desperate gambit to force Vance into the open. With each page that disappeared, she could see Vance's control slipping further, his rage building toward the kind of explosive violence that would drive him into the open. Around them, the town held its breath. Behind shuttered windows and barricaded doors, families watched the confrontation unfold with the fascinated horror of people witnessing events that would be talked about for generations. Children pressed their faces to gaps in curtains, wide-eyed with the terrible excitement of seeing their quiet street transformed into the stage for a drama that would determine their future. "Stop!" Vance roared from the bell tower, his voice cracking with fury. "Stop destroying that book. Then come down here and stop me yourself." Matilda challenged, tearing out 2 more pages at once. "Or are you too frightened to face one unarmed woman in a fair fight?" That did it. With a curse that carried clearly across the main street, Captain Silas Vance began climbing down from the bell tower, his rifle slung across his back, and murder written in every line of his body. He was a man pushed beyond rational thought by pride and fury, exactly as Matilda had hoped he would be. But he wasn't coming alone. Jake Mercer and 2 other gunmen emerged from the courthouse behind him, spreading out to cover the street with practiced efficiency that spoke of long experience in situations where violence was the final arbiter of disputes. The trap was springing both ways now, and the next few minutes would determine whether justice or corruption would control this territory's future. Vance strode down the courthouse steps, with the bearing of a man accustomed to having his orders obeyed without question. Even in civilian clothes, he moved with military precision, his hand resting on the grip of the Colt single-action Army revolver, model 1873, that hung at his hip. Behind him, Jake Mercer and the other gunmen formed a loose semicircle, their weapons ready, but not yet openly threatening. He was a man in his 50s, Matilda realized, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not the aging tyrant she'd imagined, but someone still in his prime, with the kind of predatory intelligence that had allowed him to build and maintain his criminal empire. His pale eyes fixed on her with the intensity of someone who saw her not as a person, but as an obstacle to be removed. "That's far enough," Matilda called when Vance reached the center of the street. "State your business with me, Captain. Let everyone in this town hear what you're willing to kill for." Vance stopped 20 feet away, his pale eyes fixed on the recipe book in her hands, with the intensity of a man staring at his own salvation or damnation. "You know what I want, Miss Fisher. The question is whether you're smart enough to give it to me before this situation becomes unpleasant for everyone involved. You want to destroy the evidence my brother died protecting. You want to make sure nobody ever finds out how you've been stealing water rights from tribes and settlers, selling survival to the highest bidder while children die of thirst. Your brother was a meddling fool who didn't understand the complexities of territorial development." Vance replied, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd rationalized his crimes so thoroughly that he'd begun to believe his own justifications. "This territory needs development, needs industry, needs the kind of progress that comes from decisive action rather than bureaucratic hand-wringing. It needs honest dealing more than it needs your version of progress." Judge Wilkes stepped out from behind the general store, moving with the measured dignity that had served him well in courtrooms throughout the territory. Behind him came Dr. Reeve, and the federal marshals, their weapons ready, but not yet raised in open threat. "Captain Vance," Judge Wilkes said formally, his voice carrying across the street with courtroom authority. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the territorial government, theft of public resources, and accessory to murder in the death of Klaus Fischer. Surrender your weapons and submit to federal custody. Vance's hand moved to his pistol, but he didn't draw it immediately. Instead, he studied the tactical situation with professional assessment, noting the positions of the marshals and calculating odds that didn't favor his chances of fighting his way out of town. "Judge Wilkes," he said with mock courtesy, "I'm afraid you've been misinformed about the nature of my business activities. All my contracts with railroad companies and territorial authorities are completely legal, properly documented, and approved through appropriate channels." "Are they?" Judge Wilkes reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio that contained official-looking documents. "Because I have here sworn affidavits from territorial surveyors stating that the water rights you've been selling were never legally transferred from public to private ownership. I have testimony from tribal representatives documenting systematic violations of federal treaty obligations. And I have evidence that the original survey documents supporting your claims were deliberately falsified." Vance's composure cracked slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features as he realized that his legal position might not be as secure as he'd believed. Around them, the watching townspeople sensed the shift in momentum, the moment when the seemingly invincible tyrant began to understand that his power had limits. "Those are serious accusations, Your Honor. I trust you have solid proof to support such inflammatory charges." "I do indeed." Judge Wilkes gestured toward Matilda and the recipe book she still held. "Miss Fisher has provided documentation that proves beyond doubt that you've been operating a systematic fraud designed to steal public resources for private profit. The symbols her brother copied from your files are survey markers that establish clear federal jurisdiction over water sources you've been claiming as private property. Copied illegally from confidential military documents." Vance countered his legal training reasserting itself despite the pressure of the situation. "Any evidence obtained through criminal activity is inadmissible in federal court. Not when it documents ongoing criminal conspiracy." Judge Wilkes replied smoothly, "Federal law is quite clear on the admissibility of evidence that prevents continuing harm to public welfare." The legal sparring might have continued indefinitely, but Jake Mercer was growing impatient with proceedings that didn't involve the kind of direct action he preferred. His rifle came up smoothly aimed at Judge Wilkes's chest with the casual precision of someone who killed for wages and never lost sleep over the consequences. "Enough talk," Jake said flatly. "We came here to collect the book and settle accounts. Everything else is just noise." But Jake Mercer had made a crucial error in his tactical assessment. He'd focused so intently on the federal marshals and the apparent threat they represented that he'd forgotten about Kitchie positioned behind the blacksmith shop with a clear line of sight to the courthouse steps. Kitchie had been waiting for exactly this moment, the instant when one of Vance's men committed to violence, and gave him legal justification for the shot he'd been planning since they first entered Cedar Ford. His rifle spoke with the finality of divine judgment, and Jake Mercer spun away from his intended target, his shot going wide as Kitchie's bullet took him high in the shoulder. The street erupted into chaos as everyone went for their weapons simultaneously. The federal marshals opened fire on Vance's remaining gunmen, while Dr. Reeve dove for cover behind a water trough, his medical bag clutched protectively against his chest. But in the middle of the gunfight, Matilda found herself facing Captain Silas Vance in what had become a very personal confrontation. His Colt single-action Army revolver, model 1873, was in his hand, aimed at her heart with steady confidence, despite the chaos erupting around them. "The book, Miss Fisher," he said calmly, his voice somehow audible despite the gunfire. "Give it to me now, and you might live through the next 60 seconds. Instead of complying, Matilda did something completely unexpected. She smiled. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Captain," she said, her voice carrying clearly in a sudden lull in the shooting. "You see, this isn't the real evidence book." Vance's eyes narrowed as he tried to process what she'd just told him. "What? This is just my regular recipe collection." Matilda continued holding up the book that had been the focus of so much violence and pursuit. "I copied all of Klaus's survey symbols into a different book weeks ago when I realized how valuable they were. That copy is already in Judge Wilkes's possession, along with sworn testimony about how I obtained the information." The lie came easily delivered with the kind of conviction that made it sound like absolute truth. In reality, the symbols were in both books. She'd hedged her bets by creating multiple copies hidden in different places, ensuring that no single act of violence could destroy the evidence Klaus had died protecting. The expression on Vance's face shifted from confusion to rage, to something approaching despair, as he realized that months of pursuit violence and increasingly desperate measures had been focused on the wrong target. The evidence he'd been trying to destroy was already beyond his reach, safely in the hands of federal authorities, who had the power to bring his entire operation crashing down around him. "You clever little..." He began raising his pistol with clear intent to kill her, regardless of whether it served any practical purpose. But Kitschy had been waiting for exactly this moment. His rifle spoke from his position behind the blacksmith shop, and Captain Silas Vance pitched forward into the dust of Cedar Ford's main street, his schemes and ambitions ended by a single, well-placed bullet that carried the weight of justice too long delayed. The gunfight continued for several more minutes, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. With their leader dead and their tactical position compromised, Vance's remaining men found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered by federal marshals who fought with the authority of law behind them. Jake Mercer, wounded but still dangerous, tried to make a fighting retreat toward the horses tied behind the courthouse. But his shoulder wound had cost him mobility and accuracy, and when he turned to fire on his pursuers, one of the marshals put him down with a shot that ended his career permanently. The last two gunmen threw down their weapons and raised their hands when they realized that continued resistance would only delay their appointment with territorial justice by a few violent minutes. When the smoke finally cleared, Samuel Mercer was the only survivor among Vance's inner circle, wounded, but alive, his brother dead, and his future measured in years of federal imprisonment rather than the comfortable retirement he'd planned to purchase with blood money. Judge Wilkes emerged from cover, brushing dust from his formal coat with the careful attention of someone who'd survived more than one violent encounter during his years on the frontier circuit. "Well," he said with judicial understatement, "that was considerably more exciting than most court sessions. Justice and new beginnings." The trial of Samuel Mercer and the surviving members of Vance's conspiracy took place 3 weeks later in the territorial capital, with Judge Wilkes presiding over proceedings that drew newspaper reporters from as far away as Denver and San Francisco. The evidence Matilda provided, combined with testimony from tribal representatives and homesteaders who'd been driven from their land, painted a comprehensive picture of systematic corruption that shocked even observers who thought they'd seen everything the frontier had to offer. The moment when Matilda took the witness stand was one that would be remembered and discussed in legal circles for years to come. She walked to the front of the packed courtroom with quiet dignity, carrying the recipe book that had caused so much violence and wearing a simple dress that spoke of frontier practicality rather than legal formality. When she placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, the entire courtroom fell silent with the kind of complete attention that comes only when people sense they're witnessing history being made. "Miss Fisher," Judge Wilkes said formally, "please tell the court how you came to possess the evidence that forms the basis of these proceedings." Matilda's voice was steady as she recounted her brother's death and the months of flight that followed, but there was something in her tone that conveyed the emotional weight of every word. When she opened the recipe book and began explaining the symbols Klaus had copied, pointing out how they were hidden among legitimate cooking notes, The courtroom listened with the fascination of people discovering that ordinary things could carry extraordinary significance. "These markings," she said, pointing to careful drawings that looked like nothing more than decorative flourishes around a bread recipe, "show that the spring on the Henderson homestead was designated for prior appropriation rights in the original territorial survey. Captain Vance had no legal right to sell exclusive access to railroad companies, and when Mr. Henderson refused to pay for water that legally belonged to everyone, Vance used violence and intimidation to drive the family from their land. When the prosecution asked her to identify Samuel Mercer in the courtroom, she looked directly at him without flinching, her gaze steady and calm. There was no hatred in her expression, no desire for personal revenge, just the implacable certainty of someone who'd seen justice perverted and was determined to see it restored. That man was present when Captain Vance threatened to kill innocent townspeople if we didn't surrender. She testified. He participated in a conspiracy that cost my brother his life and drove numerous families from their homes. He chose to profit from suffering, and he should face the consequences of that choice. Samuel Mercer received 20 years in federal prison for his role in the conspiracy. The corrupt territorial officials who'd helped Vance falsify documents received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years, their careers and reputations destroyed by the scandal that would reshape territorial politics for a generation. More importantly, Judge Wilkes issued sweeping orders that restored water rights to their proper status as public resources protected by federal law and available to all legitimate users regardless of their ability to pay bribes. The San Carlos Reservation received immediate relief shipments of water and supplies, while the families who'd been driven from their homesteads were provided with federal assistance to rebuild their lives on land that was now legally protected from future interference. But for Matilda, the most meaningful moment came when she visited Klaus's grave in the small cemetery outside Devil's Wash, carrying a fresh loaf of bread baked with the sourdough starter that had survived their entire ordeal. "I kept my promise," she said to the simple wooden cross that marked her brother's resting place. "The evidence you died protecting brought justice for everyone you were trying to help. The water rights are restored, the corrupt officials are in prison, and the families can return to their homes." She placed the bread on the grave with careful reverence, along with a wildflower bouquet Ruth Turner had picked that morning. The girl had insisted on coming to the cemetery, wanting to pay her respects to a man she'd never met, but whose sacrifice had protected her family's future. "I found someone, Klaus." Matilda continued, her voice soft with emotion. "Someone good, someone who understands what you were trying to accomplish. Someone who helped me finish what you started. I think you would have liked him." Kitchie appeared at her shoulder, his presence as natural and comfortable as breathing after the weeks they'd spent together rebuilding Cedar Ford and helping the displaced families return to their homes. His shoulder had healed cleanly, leaving only another scar to add to his collection of reminders about the cost of doing the right thing in a world that didn't always reward virtue. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Matilda nodded, taking one last look at her brother's grave before turning toward the future they were building together. They walked back to Cedar Ford, hand in hand, past fields where homesteaders were planting crops that would be watered by springs that now belonged to everyone, past the schoolhouse, where Ruth Turner was learning to read legal documents so she could help her father protect their restored property rights. The town itself was growing, transformed from a desperate frontier settlement into a genuine community by the presence of people who planned to stay and build something lasting. Dark Turker. Reeve had established a permanent clinic Judge Wilkes had arranged for a resident deputy marshal, and Turner was talking about opening a proper general store that could serve the needs of travelers and settlers alike. But the most important change was in the kitchen of the house Matilda and Kitchie were building together on the eastern edge of town. where the sourdough starter that had carried her through months of flight and fear now bubbled contentedly in a proper ceramic crock, ready to provide bread for whatever community they chose to create. The house itself was modest, but well built with wide windows that let in the desert light, and a kitchen large enough to accommodate the kind of cooking that fed communities rather than just individuals. Kitchi had designed it with the practical eye of someone who understood frontier living, while Matilda had insisted on details that would make it feel like home shelves for her growing collection of recipe books, a root cellar for storing preserved foods, and a large table where neighbors could gather for meals and conversation. "Smells like home," Kitchi said, breathing in the familiar aroma of rising dough that had become their shared comfort and promise of continuity. "It is home," Matilda replied, leaning into his embrace as they watched the sun set over country that had been purchased with blood and courage, but was now free to nurture the dreams of anyone brave enough to plant them. Outside their window, children played in streets where gunfighters had once ruled through fear and violence. Ruth Turner ran past, her rifle replaced by school books, and her young face bright with the kind of hope that only comes when people have reason to believe the future will be better than the past. "Think we'll have visitors for dinner?" Kitchi asked, noting the extra places Matilda had set at their kitchen table. Turner said he might stop by with news from the territorial capital. Dr. Reeve wants to discuss expanding the clinic, and Ruth's been asking for sourdough pancake lessons. "Sounds like we'll need more flour." Good thing the general store started carrying proper wheat flour again, now that the supply lines are secure. They moved around their kitchen with the easy coordination of people who'd learned to work together under pressure, and found that the partnership translated beautifully to peaceful circumstances. Kitchi tended the fire, while Matilda shaped loaves with a careful attention that had sustained her through every crisis, every moment of doubt, every mile of desperate flight that had brought them to this place of safety and belonging. The evening light streaming through their windows was the deep gold of autumn sunset, painting everything it touched with warmth that spoke of harvest and abundance. Through the open door, they could hear the sounds of a community settling into evening routines, children being called in for supper, neighbors discussing the day's work, the comfortable noise of people who had reason to feel secure in their homes. "Any regrets?" Kitchi asked as they settled at the table to wait for their guests and watch the bread rise in the warm kitchen air. Matilda considered the question seriously, thinking of all the paths not taken, all the safer choices she might have made, all the comfortable anonymity she'd sacrificed in the name of justice for a dead brother and hope for a living community. "Only one," she said finally. "I wish Klaus could have lived to see how his courage helped so many people. I wish he could have met you, could have seen what we've built here together." Kitchi's hand found hers across the table, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become their signature of comfort and connection. "I think he does see it," he said quietly. "I think he knows that his sacrifice meant something, that it led to something good and lasting and worth the price he paid." A soft knock at the door announced the arrival of their first guest. Dr. Reeve entered carrying his medical bag and a bottle of wine he'd been saving for a special occasion. His weathered face creased with the satisfaction of someone who'd lived to see justice prevail over corruption. "Good evening," he said formally, then broke into a grin. "I bring news from the territorial capital. The governor has officially appointed a new special master, appointed by the territorial judge, and a deputy of the U.S. Surveyor General. Someone with a reputation for honesty and a commitment to enforcing the law fairly. The days of selling survival to the highest bidder are officially over." Turner arrived shortly after, accompanied by Ruth and the other homesteaders, who'd become something approaching a council of elders for the growing community. They brought news of their own crops planted and thriving new families arriving to claim homesteads that were now legally protected plans for a proper church and a schoolhouse large enough to serve children from throughout the valley. To Klaus Fischer, Turner said when they'd all gathered around the table, raising his cup in a toast that brought sudden tears to Matilda's eyes. A man who died for something bigger than himself, and whose sacrifice made all of this possible. To Klaus, they echoed, and the words carried the weight of genuine respect and gratitude. As the evening progressed, and the conversation turned to practical matters of community building, Matilda found herself watching the faces around her table with something approaching wonder. These were people who'd been scattered by violence and fear, driven from their homes by a system that valued profit over human dignity. But they'd found their way back together, united by shared struggle and mutual dependence, ready to build something that would last. Later, after the guests had gone home to their own rebuilt lives, Matilda and Kitchi stood at their kitchen window, watching the lights come on in houses throughout the valley. Each light represented a family that was safe, a homestead that was legally protected, a future that was secure, because people had been willing to risk everything for justice. "Look at that," Matilda whispered, pointing to where the Turner family was visible through their cabin windows, working together to repair a section of fence by lamplight. It was a simple domestic scene, but it carried profound significance, the visible proof that their fight had been worth everything it cost. "We did that," Kitchi said quietly. "All of us together. We took something broken and made it whole again." Outside, the desert wind that had once carried threats and gunfire now brought the scent of growing things and the voices of children who would inherit a world where water belonged to everyone, and justice was more than just a word carved on courthouse stones. In their kitchen, the sourdough bubbled with ancient life and the promise of tomorrow's bread, while two people who'd found each other in the midst of violence and fear planned a future built on the simple truth that some things love justice and the sharing of what sustains life were worth whatever it cost to protect them. The recipe book that had caused so much trouble sat open on the kitchen counter, its pages now filled with new notes about feeding a community instead of just surviving in hostile territory. Matilda had added careful instructions for baking bread for large gatherings, for preserving food to help families through hard times, for teaching children the ancient arts that connected them to the land and to each other. Klaus's symbols were still there, carefully preserved as evidence and memorial. But they were surrounded now by the kind of knowledge that built homes instead of just preventing their destruction. And on the last page, in careful script that would last as long as the book itself, she'd written, "For Klaus, who taught me that some things are worth dying for. For Kitchi, who taught me that some things are worth living for. For the children of Cedar Ford, who will inherit a world where courage still matters and justice still means something. May this bread feed them well, and may they never forget the price that was paid for their freedom to grow where they choose to plant themselves." As the night deepened and the last lights began to go out in the valley below, Matilda Fischer looked around the kitchen that had become the heart of their new life and felt something she'd thought was lost forever when Klaus died. The absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, with exactly the right person at her side. The frontier was still harsh, still unforgiving to those who lacked the strength or wisdom to meet its challenges. But it was also full of possibility for people brave enough to see beyond survival to the kinds of dreams that could take root in the most unlikely soil. And in Cedar Ford, where justice had been purchased with blood and courage, where water flowed free to anyone who needed it, where bread rose in kitchens warmed by love and protected by law, those dreams were growing into something that would last. "Look at what we've done," Matilda whispered to Kitchi as they prepared to close the curtains and bank the fire for the night. Through their window, the valley stretched away toward distant mountains, dotted with the lights of families who could sleep peacefully because justice had finally found its way to this harsh and beautiful country.